In 1997, a young Amish woman walked down a set of basement stairs in her father's farmhouse. She never walked back up. No missing person report was ever filed. No search party was ever organized. No posters were ever printed. When neighbors asked where she'd gone, her father had answers ready. Ohio, relatives, the English world. The stories changed, but the tone never did. Sad, resigned, a grieving man too wounded to say more. And because he was a bishop, because he was respected, because nobody wanted to pry into someone else's pain, not a single person thought to check. For nearly 25 years, she existed in a place no one knew was there. Until one afternoon, a rotted board gave way. To understand how a woman could disappear for nearly 25 years without anyone noticing, you first have to understand the world she disappeared from. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, is home to one of the largest and most traditional Amish populations in the United States. Approximately 40,000 people living according to rules that would seem impossible to most Americans in the 21st century. No electricity from the public grid, though some use generators or batteries for specific approved purposes. No automobiles, just horse-drawn buggies that clip-clop along country roads, while tourists snap photographs from their air-conditioned SUVs. Limited formal education that typically ends at 8th grade, after which young people are expected to work on family farms or learn trades that will serve the community. German dialect, known as Pennsylvania Dutch, spoken at home and in church, with English reserved for interactions with the outside world. Plain clothing without patterns or adornment, women in head coverings and long dresses, men in dark suits with broad-brimmed hats. This isn't a tourist attraction or a historical reenactment. This is everyday life for tens of thousands of people who have chosen to remain separate from the modern world. The Amish organize themselves into church districts, each consisting of 20 to 40 families who worship together, support each other, and govern themselves according to their interpretation of scripture and tradition. There are no church buildings in the traditional sense. Instead, services rotate among members' homes, with families taking turns hosting the congregation every few weeks. Each district is led by a bishop, supported by ministers and deacons, and the bishop's authority over spiritual and community matters is essentially absolute within his district. This is the crucial detail that makes everything else in this story possible. The bishop isn't elected or appointed in the way most Americans understand leadership. He's chosen by lot, a process believed to reflect God's will rather than human judgment. When a district needs a new bishop, the congregation nominates men from among themselves, and those nominees draw from a collection of hymnals. One hymnal contains a slip of paper, and whoever draws that hymnal becomes the new bishop, chosen not by popular vote, but by divine selection. The implications of this system are profound, and, as Anna Stoltzfus would learn, potentially devastating. A bishop chosen through this sacred process cannot easily be questioned. His authority comes not from the community, but from the Almighty, and challenging his decisions carries spiritual weight that few are willing to bear. Bishops resolve disputes between families, counsel troubled marriages, guide young people through their spiritual development, and enforce the Ordnung, the unwritten code of conduct that governs everything from the style of one's clothing to the technology one may use. When a bishop says something is so, it is so, and the faithful accept his judgment, because to do otherwise would feel like rebellion against the very structure of their world. This system works well enough most of the time, producing communities of remarkable cohesion and mutual support, but it also creates conditions where abuse can flourish unchecked. There is no external oversight, no denominational hierarchy, no mechanism for accountability beyond the conscience of the bishop himself. A good man in this position can do tremendous good for his community. A predator in this position can do tremendous harm with virtually no one to stop him. The Stoltzfus farm sat on a gentle rise in the heart of Lancaster County, surrounded by fields of corn and wheat that stretched toward the horizon like a patchwork quilt in shades of gold and green. The property had been in the family for 4 generations, passed down from father to son in an unbroken chain that connected the present to the distant past. The farmhouse itself was a sturdy two-story structure with a wraparound porch, painted white in the traditional style, with a large red barn nearby and various outbuildings scattered across the property. Visitors over the years would have seen exactly what they expected to see. An immaculate Amish homestead maintained with the kind of care that comes from generations of practice and pride. Chickens scratched in the yard, horses stood placid in their paddock, and laundry flapped on the line in the ever-present breeze that swept across the Pennsylvania countryside. Nothing about the exterior suggested anything unusual. Nothing hinted at the concrete room beneath the cellar floor. The Stoltzfus family name carried weight in the community, the kind of quiet respect that accumulates over generations of faithful service. Levi's grandfather had been a bishop. His father had served as a minister. The family was known for charitable giving, for opening their home to church services, for Levi's measured demeanor when settling disputes that threatened to divide neighbors or families. When Levi himself was chosen as bishop in 1988, many in the community saw it as confirmation of what they already believed. The Stoltzfus family was blessed, worthy of the trust placed in them. Nobody thought to ask what might happen if that trust was misplaced. Nobody considered the possibility that a man could wear the mask of righteousness while concealing something unspeakable beneath. The community had faith, and faith, by definition, doesn't require evidence. But the Stoltzfus farm didn't exist in isolation from the broader world. English neighbors, the Amish term for anyone who isn't Amish, lived on adjacent properties, did business with Amish farmers, passed them on country roads, and developed the kind of casual familiarity that comes from decades of proximity. Harold Weaver had delivered mail to Amish farms in the area for 32 years, including regular stops at the Stoltzfus property. He knew everyone's habits, noticed when patterns changed, recognized when something seemed slightly off. Margaret Brennan ran a small general store that served both Amish and English customers, a gathering place where gossip flowed as freely as the coffee. Russell Crawford had been a deputy with the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office for most of his adult life, responding to occasional calls involving Amish families, property disputes, traffic accidents, the rare domestic disturbance that couldn't be resolved internally. These people knew the Stoltzfus farm. They knew Bishop Levi. They had opportunities over the years to notice that something wasn't quite right. What they did with those opportunities, and what they failed to do, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The English neighbors operated by an unwritten rule when it came to Amish business. Don't interfere unless you're asked. The Amish had their ways, their customs, their methods for handling problems, and outsiders who inserted themselves where they weren't wanted usually caused more trouble than they solved. Harold Weaver noticed things over the years, the way mail patterns changed at the Stoltzfus farm, the absence of any correspondence from the daughter who had supposedly moved to Ohio, but he told himself it wasn't his place to ask questions. Maggie Brennan heard whispers from other customers, fragments of conversation about the bishop's household that never quite cohered into a complete picture, but she reminded herself that gossip was unkind and probably unfounded. Deputy Crawford responded to calls at the Stoltzfus farm exactly twice in his entire career, both times for routine matters that were resolved without incident. He remembered the bishop as cooperative, soft-spoken, the kind of man who made you feel slightly guilty for bothering him with official business. None of them connected the dots. None of them looked behind the comfortable assumptions that respectable men don't do terrible things. And because none of them looked, a woman remained trapped in darkness while the sun rose and set above her, season after season, year after year, for nearly a quarter of a century. Before we continue this story, I need you to do something for me. If you want to find out what happens next, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single detail of this case. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because stories like this one need to be told. Now, let's get back to what happened in that basement. Levi Stoltzfus was born in the spring of 1941, the third of 7 children in a household where faith and farming were the twin pillars of existence. His childhood, by all available accounts, was unremarkable in the way that Amish childhoods tend to be. Long days of physical labor, one-room schoolhouse education through 8th grade, immersion in religious practice from the moment he could understand the words being spoken around him. He learned to milk cows before he learned to read, helped with planting and harvest as soon as he was strong enough to lift a tool, and absorbed the rhythms of a life that had remained essentially unchanged for generations. Teachers in the community school remembered him as bright but distant, a boy who completed his work with unusual focus, but never quite connected with his peers the way other children did. He had few close friends, and seemed content with his own company, a trait that adults interpreted as maturity, or perhaps shyness. Nobody saw anything to worry about. Nobody imagined that the quiet boy in the third row might one day become a monster. At 14, Levi experienced Rumspringa, the period in Amish life when teenagers are permitted to explore the outside world before making their final commitment to the church. For most young people, Rumspringa involves at least some experimentation, wearing English clothes, listening to the radio, riding in cars, perhaps attending a party or two. Some push further, drinking alcohol or dating non-Amish partners, testing the boundaries to see if the outside world holds something worth leaving their community to find. Levi showed no interest in any of it. While other boys his age were sneaking cigarettes behind barns and speculating about English girls, Levi stayed home, worked on the farm, and told his parents he'd already made his choice. He knew where he belonged. He knew what God wanted from him. His parents were proud of their son's devotion, and neighbors pointed to him as an example for their own children. "That Stoltzfus boy knows his mind," they said. "He'll make a fine man someday." What they interpreted as spiritual certainty may have been something else entirely. The early manifestation of a personality that needed control above all else, that couldn't tolerate uncertainty or ambiguity, that demanded a framework where his authority would never be challenged. At 19, Levi was baptized into the Amish church, formally committing himself to the community and its rules for the rest of his life. At 22, he married Miriam Yoder, a quiet 18-year-old from a neighboring district who seemed ideally suited to be a bishop's wife, though neither of them knew yet that he would one day hold that position. Miriam was gentle and kind, skilled in traditional crafts, deeply religious in a way that emphasized God's love rather than his judgment. People who knew her remembered her warmth, her gift for soothing crying babies and calming anxious mothers, her ability to make anyone feel welcome in her home. The marriage appeared solid from the outside, the union of a devoted man and a devoted woman building a life together, according to the patterns their parents and grandparents had established before them. Levi worked the farm, Miriam kept the house. They attended every church service, hosted their share of community events, and seemed to embody the Amish ideal of partnership. But there were signs, small enough to dismiss but present nonetheless, that something in the Stoltzfus household wasn't quite right. Miriam's sister would later recall that Miriam sometimes seemed tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix, carrying a weariness that went deeper than the physical demands of farm life. A neighbor remembered seeing Miriam weeping in her garden once, alone among the vegetable rows, her face turned away from the house as if she couldn't bear to be seen. When asked if something was wrong, Miriam wiped her eyes and said she was fine, just missing her mother who had passed the previous year, and the neighbor accepted the explanation because what else could she do? Miriam never complained about her husband, never suggested that anything was amiss, and in a culture where wives submit to their husband's authority as a matter of religious duty, her silence could mean anything or nothing. Nobody pressed. Nobody asked the questions that might have revealed uncomfortable truths, and Miriam, whatever she knew or suspected, took her secrets with her to the grave. In 1979, after years of trying, Miriam gave birth to a daughter. Anna came into the world after 2 miscarriages and countless prayers, her arrival seen as a sign of God's grace after so much heartbreak. She was a serious child from the beginning, thoughtful and observant, with her mother's gentle nature and her father's intense focus. She loved animals, particularly the farm cats that lived in the barn, naming each one and mourning them when they died. She excelled at reading, devouring the family Bible and any other books she could access, asking questions that sometimes surprised adults with their depth. "That girl has a mind that wants more than we can give her," her teacher once said, meaning it as a compliment, but perhaps recognizing something that should have been a warning. Anna was deeply attached to her mother, shadowing Miriam through daily tasks, learning to cook and sew and garden, absorbing the rhythms of womanhood in a world where a woman's options were limited by design. When Levi was chosen as bishop in 1988 through the sacred lot process, Anna was 9 years old enough to understand that her father had become an important man, young enough not to understand what that importance might cost. When the previous bishop died in 1988, Levi Stoltzfus drew the hymnal containing the sacred slip of paper. Some in the congregation saw providence at work, the Stoltzfus family returning to spiritual leadership, God's blessing on a devout household. A smaller number felt a flicker of unease they couldn't quite explain, a vague sense that something about Levi didn't sit right, though they couldn't have said what it was. Those feelings were dismissed as quickly as they arose. Over the following years, Bishop Levi Stoltzfus would counsel grieving families, perform weddings, discipline wayward youth, and maintain the image of a humble servant of his community. He would also transform his own daughter into a prisoner, using the authority of his position as a shield against suspicion, and the isolation of his farm as a fortress against discovery. Investigators who later studied the case would construct a psychological profile of Levi Stoltzfus that explained, if not excused, his capacity for evil. He exhibited traits consistent with what psychologists call the dark triad of personality: narcissism, an inflated sense of his own importance and entitlement; Machiavellianism, a calculating willingness to manipulate others for his own benefit; and psychopathy, a fundamental lack of empathy for the suffering of others. These traits don't automatically make someone a predator, but combined with the right circumstances, they create the potential for profound harm. Levi's religious authority provided both cover and justification for his actions. In his mind, investigators concluded, he didn't see himself as a criminal or an abuser. He saw himself as chosen, set apart for purposes that ordinary people couldn't understand. The rules that governed everyone else didn't apply to him because he operated on a different level, answering to a higher power that had selected him for leadership. This wasn't a disguise he wore to fool others. It was a lens through which he genuinely interpreted his own behavior. I want to know where you're watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below, whether you're here from Texas or California, New York, or somewhere overseas. And if you've made it this far into the story, let me know you're still with me by commenting, "I am still here." Let's see who's paying attention, because this story is about to take a turn that nobody saw coming. Anna Stoltzfus came into the world on March 15, 1979, after her mother Miriam endured 2 miscarriages and years of heartbreak that tested her faith in ways she rarely spoke about. Her arrival was celebrated throughout the church district as evidence of God's mercy, a blessing bestowed upon a couple who had waited so long and prayed so hard for a child. From her earliest days, Anna was a serious child, carrying herself with a gravity that seemed unusual for someone so young, as if she understood instinctively that the world was a place where careful attention was required for survival. She had her mother's brown eyes and gentle disposition, her father's focused intensity, and a mind that absorbed everything around her with remarkable clarity. The community watched her grow with the kind of proprietary interest that small communities often take in their children, noting her progress through the milestones of Amish girlhood: her first steps, her first words in Pennsylvania Dutch, her first day at the one-room schoolhouse where children of all ages learned together. Anna loved the farm animals with a passion that bordered on obsession, particularly the cats that lived in the barn and kept the mouse population under control. She named each one, tracking their personalities and preferences with the attention to detail that a scientist might bring to a research project, and she wept inconsolably when they died, even though death was a routine part of farm life that other children seemed to accept without difficulty. "That girl feels too much," her grandmother said once, intending it as gentle criticism. But Miriam defended her daughter fiercely. "She feels exactly right," Miriam replied. "The world needs people who notice when something is hurting." It was a philosophy Miriam tried to pass on to her daughter, the idea that sensitivity was a gift rather than a weakness, that paying attention to suffering was the first step toward alleviating it. Anna absorbed these lessons along with everything else her mother taught her: building a moral framework that would sustain her through horrors neither of them could have imagined. Her teacher at the community school, a woman named Sarah Miller, who had been educating Amish children for 3 decades, recognized something special in Anna from the beginning. The girl learned to read faster than her peers, blazing through the limited curriculum and asking for more while other students struggled with basics. She asked questions that went beyond the material, wanting to understand not just what was true, but why it was true, probing the edges of knowledge in ways that sometimes made adults uncomfortable. "Anna has a mind that wants more than we can give her," Sarah told Miriam at one of their rare private conversations, careful not to sound critical of the community's educational limits while acknowledging that this particular child might chafe against them. Miriam nodded, recognizing the truth of the observation, and wondered privately whether her daughter would find contentment within the boundaries of their world, or whether she would eventually need to seek something beyond. The relationship between Anna and her father was complicated from the start, though Anna wouldn't understand the full dimensions of that complexity until much later. As a young child, she worshipped Levi the way daughters often worship their fathers, seeing him as powerful and wise, deserving of the respect the community showed him. He was the bishop, chosen by sacred lot, and was her father, the man who provided for their family and protected them from the dangers of the outside world. His approval felt sacred, worth pursuing through obedience and hard work, and Anna tried constantly to earn it. But Levi's affection was inconsistent in ways that kept her perpetually off balance. One day he would be warm and engaged, praising her accomplishments and calling her his little helper. The next he would be cold and dismissive, finding fault with everything she did and withdrawing into silences that lasted for hours. Anna learned early to read his moods, adjusting her behavior to avoid his displeasure, walking on eggshells without understanding why the floor was so fragile. This was survival training, though she didn't know it yet. Preparation for a future where reading his moods would mean the difference between suffering and even greater suffering. When Anna began developing physically around age 12, something shifted in the way her father looked at her. She couldn't have named it then, didn't have the vocabulary or the conceptual framework to understand what she was sensing, but she felt it in her body before she could process it in her mind. "I started wanting to disappear," she would later tell investigators, describing the sensation of being watched in ways that made her skin crawl. Not actually disappear, but become invisible, become nothing, become too small to notice. Miriam noticed the change in her daughter's demeanor, and, though she never spoke directly about her fears, began taking steps to protect Anna in the only ways available to her. She ensured that Anna was rarely alone with Levi for extended periods. She took her daughter on errands to other farms, creating excuses for them to be elsewhere. She taught Anna, in coded language that Amish modesty required, about her body and her right to protect it from anyone who might try to harm her. But Miriam never confronted Levi directly. Perhaps she didn't fully believe what she suspected. Perhaps she was afraid of what would happen if she did. Perhaps she simply didn't know how to challenge a bishop in a world where such challenges carried enormous weight. In the spring of 1996, Miriam developed what she called a chest cold that won't quit, a persistent cough that worsened over weeks, while she assured everyone she was fine and would be better soon. The Amish approach to medical care is complicated, not forbidden, but often delayed in favor of home remedies, herbal treatments, and prayer. By the time Miriam agreed to see a doctor, the infection had spread to her heart, causing damage that couldn't be repaired. She died on May 23, 1996, at the age of 43, leaving behind a 17-year-old daughter and a husband whose true nature she may have suspected, but never fully confronted. The funeral was held according to Amish tradition, hundreds of people in black gathering to pay respects to a woman who had been loved throughout the community. Anna stood beside her father at the graveside, feeling as though she were watching herself from somewhere very far away, disconnected from her body in a way that would become familiar in the years ahead. Levi's hand rested on her shoulder, heavier than it had ever felt before, and as they lowered Miriam into the ground, Anna understood with terrible clarity that her shield was gone. The months following Miriam's death transformed the Stoltzfus household in ways that outsiders couldn't see, and Anna couldn't escape. Levi pulled his daughter out of school, claiming she was needed at home to manage the household chores that Miriam had always handled. He refused visitors, telling concerned neighbors that they needed time to grieve privately and would welcome company when they were ready. He began controlling every aspect of Anna's existence: what she ate, when she slept, who she could speak to, where she could go, with an intensity that he framed as protection, but which felt increasingly like imprisonment. Anna wrote in a journal during this period, hiding it beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom, recording her confusion and growing fear in words she could barely admit to herself. "Dottie says I'm all he has now," she wrote in one entry that investigators would later recover. "He says we need to take care of each other. But taking care feels different now. It feels like a cage with invisible bars." The community accepted Levi's behavior as the grief of a devastated husband and father. No one thought to check on Anna directly. And by the spring of 1997, less than a month after her 18th birthday, she would vanish from the world above. Not because she left, but because she was taken. The weeks leading up to Anna's disappearance were marked by an escalation that felt both terrifying and somehow inevitable, each day bringing new restrictions that pushed the boundaries of what she thought possible until the boundaries themselves seemed to vanish entirely. By early April of 1997, Anna was no longer permitted to leave the farmhouse without Levi's explicit permission, which was granted rarely and only for specific purposes he controlled. He monitored her conversations with the few visitors who still came to the property, standing close enough to hear every word, his presence a constant reminder that she was being watched. He checked her journal regularly, searching for what he called inappropriate thoughts, and punished her when he found entries that displeased him. The punishments were escalating alongside the restrictions: standing in the corner for hours at a time, fasting as spiritual discipline, confinement to her bedroom for days on end. Anna told herself this was grief, that they were both broken from losing Miriam, that eventually the pain would fade, and her father would return to something resembling the man she thought she knew. She kept waiting for it to get better. It never got better. The grooming process that Levi employed was textbook in its execution, following patterns that experts in child abuse would recognize immediately, but that Anna had no framework to understand. Isolation came first, cutting her off from friends, family, community, anyone who might notice what was happening or offer an alternative perspective on her situation. Then came normalization, the gradual escalation of control and violation, until each new intrusion seemed like a small extension of what had come before, never a giant leap that might trigger resistance. Spiritual manipulation wove through everything else, Levi framing his demands in religious terms that made disobedience feel like betrayal of everything she'd been taught. Obedience to him was obedience to God. Her body was not her own, it belonged to the Lord, and the Lord's representative on earth was her father, the bishop. Finally came dependency. With her mother dead and no one else to turn to, Anna relied on Levi for everything: food, shelter, human contact, the validation that she existed at all. He exploited this ruthlessly, alternating between cruelty and kindness to keep her off balance, never allowing her to feel secure enough to resist what was happening. April 17, 1997, began like any other day in the month since Miriam's death. Anna rose early, prepared breakfast, cleaned the kitchen, and waited for instructions. The farmhouse smelled of wood smoke and boiled potatoes, familiar scents that still carried traces of her mother's presence, even though Miriam had been gone nearly a year. Levi ate in silence, reading from scripture as he did every morning, his expression revealing nothing of what he planned. Anna had just turned 18 a month earlier, though no celebration had marked the occasion. Around mid-morning, he called her from the top of the stairs that led down to the cellar. "Come help me with something, May Leeway," he said, using the Pennsylvania Dutch term of endearment that had once made her feel loved and now made her feel something closer to dread. There was no warning in his tone, no indication that everything was about to change forever. Anna descended the wooden steps as she had hundreds of times before, her fingers brushing past hanging tools and old canning jars as she made her way into the dim space below. The cellar was lit by a single bare bulb that cast shadows into every corner, revealing the same stone walls and packed earth floor she'd known her entire life. She expected Levi to ask her to retrieve something from the canning shelves, or to help move some piece of equipment, or to perform one of the countless small tasks that farm life required. Instead, when she reached the bottom of the stairs and turned to face him, she heard a sound that would echo in her nightmares for decades: the metallic scrape of a bolt sliding home, followed by a second lock engaging, followed by silence. She stood perfectly still, processing what she'd heard, trying to reconcile it with any explanation that made sense. "Daddy," she called up the stairs. "Why did you lock it?" His answer came through the heavy wooden door, patient as if explaining something to a slow child. "This is where you'll stay now." The first hours were a blur of disbelief and bargaining, Anna's mind cycling through every possible interpretation that didn't require accepting what was actually happening. This must be a punishment, she told herself. He'll let me out by dinner, by tomorrow, by Sunday at the latest. She called up to him through the door, apologizing for whatever she'd done wrong, promising to be better, begging for an explanation she could understand. He didn't respond. She heard his footsteps moving through the house above her, heard the creak of his chair as he sat down, heard nothing that suggested this was temporary or that her pleas had reached him. Minutes stretched into hours. The dim light from the single bulb revealed a space that had been prepared. A thin mattress in one corner, a bucket for waste, a jug of water, a kerosene lamp in case the electricity failed. Evidence of planning. Evidence that this wasn't impulsive, wasn't a momentary cruelty that would pass. Her father had prepared this room for her. He had known this day was coming even if she hadn't. The psychological experience of those first hours and days would stay with Anna forever, shaping her understanding of herself and her capacity to endure. Disbelief came first, her mind refusing to accept the reality of her situation, because acceptance would mean acknowledging that her father was capable of something monstrous. Bargaining followed, the desperate search for actions she could take, or words she could say that would unlock the door and restore the world to something recognizable. Panic arrived when bargaining failed, waves of terror that made the walls feel like they were closing in and the air too thick to breathe. She screamed until her throat was raw, pounded on the door until her hands were bruised, threw herself against the walls as if she could somehow break through stone and concrete and escape into the daylight she could no longer see. And then, when the screaming and the pounding and the throwing accomplished nothing, dissociation set in. A strange floating sensation, as if she were watching herself from somewhere outside her body, observing the trapped girl in the basement, as if she were a character in someone else's story, rather than the protagonist of her own. Levi visited twice daily in those early weeks, bringing food and emptying the waste bucket, speaking in that measured tone he used to deliver sermons to his congregation. He explained with patience that made his words even more chilling that this was for her protection. The outside world was dangerous, full of temptations and threats she couldn't understand. Only he truly loved her. Only he could keep her safe. The abuse began within days of her imprisonment, violations she couldn't resist and couldn't escape, framed as the duties of a wife, even though she was his daughter, barely 18 years old, trapped in a basement with no one to help her. When she cried, he told her that crying was weakness. When she screamed, he reminded her that no one could hear. When she prayed for rescue, he told her that God had ordained this, that her suffering was part of a divine plan too complex for her limited understanding. "Who would you call?" he asked her once rhetorically through the locked door. "Who would believe you? You think the outside world is looking for you? They forgot you already. I am all you have." If you're finding value in this story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Share it with the people you care about, because understanding how these things happen is the first step toward preventing them from happening again. Stories like Anna's need to be heard, and you can help make that happen. By early 1998, Anna realized something was happening to her body that she didn't fully understand and couldn't have predicted. The nausea came first, waves of sickness that struck without warning and left her gasping over the waste bucket. Then came the changes she could see, her stomach growing despite the meager food, her breasts tender in ways they'd never been before. Her education about reproduction had been minimal, filtered through Amish modesty and her mother's death before she could explain the full picture. Anna knew where babies came from in the most basic sense, but the connection between what was happening to her body and what her father had been doing to her took time to form in her mind. When she finally understood, the horror was absolute. She was 18 years old, imprisoned in a basement, and she was carrying her father's child. Levi's response to her pregnancy was clinical and terrifyingly composed, as if this had been part of his plan all along. "This is God's plan," he told her through the door when she confronted him with what she'd discovered. "This is how you will serve him." The abuse stopped during her pregnancy, not out of mercy, but because he was protecting the child, treating her body as a vessel whose contents mattered more than the person who contained them. He brought her slightly better food during these months. Supplements she later learned were prenatal vitamins purchased without explanation from an English pharmacy. He checked on her more frequently, monitoring her progress with the detached interest of a farmer tracking the development of livestock. Anna had no prenatal care in any meaningful sense, no medical professional to tell her whether the baby was healthy, no one to explain the changes her body was undergoing, or prepare her for what labor would be like. She learned everything the hard way, alone in the dark. The labor began in the early hours of a November morning, pain gripping her with an intensity she hadn't imagined possible. She had no concept of how long it would last, no way to measure the progress of dilation and delivery that medical professionals take for granted. She only knew that her body was being torn apart from the inside, that the pain came in waves that built and crested and ebbed only to build again, that she was completely alone in a concrete room with no one to hold her hand or tell her it would be okay. Levi came when he heard her screaming, entering the hidden room for the first time in months to serve as the only midwife she would ever have. He brought towels and hot water, spoke in instructions he'd learned from who knows where. The baby's first cry cut through years of accumulated silence, a thin wail that was simultaneously the most beautiful and most devastating sound Anna had ever heard. She held her daughter for approximately 3 hours, counting fingers and toes, memorizing every feature of the tiny face, whispering a name she would never get to use in public: Hope. She told the baby about the world outside, about sunshine and green fields and the farm cats she used to love, about a grandmother who had died before they could meet. She promised things she knew she couldn't deliver: safety, happiness, freedom. And then Levi came back, and Hope was gone. "You did well," he said as he took the child from her arms. "She'll go to a family who needs her. This is God's work." Anna begged to know where her daughter was going, who would raise her, whether she would be loved and cared for. He provided nothing. There would be more children. This was her purpose now. What Levi had built was not merely a prison, but a system, an infrastructure for exploitation that would operate for more than 2 decades. The children Anna bore were funneled into 2 separate networks, both of which relied on his authority as a bishop to deflect suspicion. Some children went to Amish families who had struggled with infertility, presented as foundlings or kin adoptions, through informal arrangements that required no paperwork and asked no questions. These families genuinely believed they were accepting orphaned or abandoned children into their homes, participating in an act of charity rather than a crime. Others went somewhere darker, to English couples willing to pay substantial sums for infants delivered outside the formal adoption system. These buyers wanted children without background checks, without home studies, without the years of waiting that legitimate adoption required. They paid between $15,000 and $40,000 per child, cash that Levi laundered through fictitious livestock sales and furniture commissions, building a small fortune while his daughter's body served as the production facility. A midwife named Ruth Byler facilitated the documentation side of the operation, providing falsified birth certificates that listed fictional mothers and convenient lies. A doctor in a neighboring county, Samuel Morrison, signed off on medical records that supported the fabrications, creating paper trails that would satisfy anyone who bothered to check. Neither of them ever met Anna or knew the full truth of where the children came from. They knew only that Bishop Stoltzfus sometimes needed help placing babies from troubled situations, and they trusted him because everyone trusted him. The system was elegant in its horror, each participant knowing only their small piece, while the full picture remained hidden behind the false wall in the cellar. The network would operate for over 2 decades before anyone discovered the truth. Anna survived those first 5 years through a combination of psychological adaptation and sheer biological determination to keep breathing. The first year was the hardest, her mind struggling to accept the reality of her captivity while simultaneously protecting itself from full comprehension. She screamed and pleaded and scratched at the walls, marking each day with a desperate need to maintain some connection to time's passage. The second year brought the first pregnancy and birth, experiences that shattered her completely and then reassembled her into something different. Someone whose entire purpose became the children she would carry and lose. By years 3 through 5, she had developed coping mechanisms that would later be recognized as classic responses to prolonged captivity. Dissociation during the worst moments, elaborate internal fantasy worlds to escape when physical escape was impossible, a kind of emotional compartmentalization that allowed her to love her children fiercely while accepting that she would lose them. She created mental files for each child, imagining their lives beyond the basement door, picturing first steps and first words and first days of school she would never witness. She named them all in secret, whispered their names like prayers in the darkness: Hope, Grace, Samuel, Elizabeth, Thomas. She told them stories about the world outside, about seasons changing and holidays arriving, and all the ordinary miracles they would experience without her. This was survival mechanism and torture simultaneously, the imagined lives underscoring everything she was missing while providing the only reason she had to keep going. Without her children, even the ones she'd lost, Anna would have had no reason to survive. With them, she had 23 reasons, each one a heartbreak and a lifeline at the same time. By the middle of her captivity, Anna's existence had settled into a terrible rhythm that repeated with minor variations year after year after year. The cycle was approximately 18 months long, beginning with the discovery that she was pregnant again, which meant the abuse would pause while Levi protected the child growing inside her. 9 months of gestation followed, months spent in the same concrete room with the same dim light, her body changing in ways she could feel but couldn't properly monitor, fighting infections and nutritional deficiencies with whatever makeshift remedies she could manage from the limited supplies he provided. Then labor would come, sometimes lasting hours and sometimes days, alone except for Levi's inexpert assistance and the towels and water he brought down from the world above. A few hours or days with the newborn followed, precious time Anna hoarded like treasure, memorizing every feature and whispering every hope before the inevitable separation. By the end of 2010, Anna had given birth to 15 children, 15 lives that had passed through her body and her arms, before disappearing into a world she could no longer access. She later testified about each one with the kind of detailed recall that astonished investigators and heartbroken therapists alike. The 6th child, born in 2003, had a birthmark on her left shoulder shaped like a crescent moon. The 8th child, born in 2005, cried for hours after delivery, but calmed immediately when Anna sang to her, a lullaby Miriam had sung decades before. The 11th child, born in 2007, was the smallest and most fragile, and Anna spent 3 days convinced he wouldn't survive before his breathing finally steadied and strengthened. She remembered them all with perfect clarity, their weights and lengths and cries and faces, because remembering them was all she had. The children's fates varied according to Levi's network and the demand at any given time. The earlier children went primarily to Amish families, absorbed into communities where questions weren't asked and paperwork wasn't required. These children were raised in loving homes for the most part, though they carried biological inheritances they knew nothing about, products of violence planted in the soil of traditional families who believed they were doing God's work by raising foundlings. As the years passed and Levi's ambitions grew, more children were funneled to English buyers through increasingly desperate channels. The prices rose as the operation expanded, reaching $40,000 per child by the late 2000s. Levi's bank records showed irregular deposits during this period, always in cash, always explained if anyone asked as proceeds from livestock sales or furniture commissions. Nobody asked very often. Bishops weren't subject to the kind of scrutiny that might have revealed the truth. At least 4 children didn't survive their first days of life, a fact that Anna carried as a weight separate from all her other burdens. She remembered each stillbirth and each infant death with excruciating clarity. The baby who never drew breath, the baby who breathed for 3 hours before fading, the twins who came too early and too small to save. Levi removed the bodies without ceremony or explanation, taking them somewhere she would never learn, denying her even the comfort of knowing where her children were buried. These losses compounded the trauma of the children who lived and were taken, creating layers of grief that built upon each other until grief itself became the constant background noise of her existence. She mourned children she'd held and children she'd lost before she could hold them. She mourned the mother she'd been and the mother she could never become. She mourned herself, the 18-year-old girl who had walked down those cellar stairs expecting to help with a chore and instead had entered a nightmare that wouldn't end. Anna's strategies for mental survival evolved over the years, becoming more sophisticated as her need for psychological refuge intensified. The journal she'd started keeping in the early months continued throughout her captivity, though she had to hide it with increasing care as Levi searched her space regularly. She used scraps of paper he occasionally provided, receipts, packaging, whatever scraps she could salvage, and wrote in a code that mixed German and English with symbols of her own invention. She hid these scraps in cracks in the concrete, behind the mattress, in the hem of her single dress, building an archive of her existence that she knew might never be found, but had to exist anyway. Writing was proof that she was real, that she had thoughts and feelings and memories that mattered, that she was a person even when everything around her tried to reduce her to something less. The memory palace she constructed in her mind became her primary refuge, an elaborate internal structure where each of her children had a room and a story. She imagined their lives beyond the basement in extraordinary detail, picturing birthday parties and graduation ceremonies and weddings she would never attend. Hope, her first child, became a teacher in her imagination, patient and kind like Miriam had been. Samuel, her 5th, became a farmer who inherited a love of animals from a mother he'd never know. These fantasies were survival mechanism and torture simultaneously, each imagined happiness underscoring what she was missing while providing the only escape available. "I lived in my head more than I lived in my body," she would later explain to therapists. "My body was a prison. My mind was the only freedom I had." The close calls during these years were numerous enough to fuel both hope and despair in roughly equal measure. In 2004, a delivery driver dropping off supplies at a neighboring farm heard what sounded like crying, specifically like a woman in distress, coming from the direction of the Stoltzfus property. He paused, listened, considered walking over to investigate. The sound stopped. "I told myself it was the wind," he testified years later, his voice breaking. "Or an animal. That's what you do when you don't want to get involved. You tell yourself a story that lets you drive away." In 2007, a distant cousin of Miriam's visited the area and asked about Anna. Levi explained smoothly and without hesitation that Anna had left the faith years ago and wanted no contact with family. The cousin accepted this explanation because it happened sometimes, young people leaving the Amish world for the temptations of English life, and she returned home without asking the follow-up questions that might have revealed the lie. Thank you for being here and supporting this channel. Your engagement means everything. If you want to be part of this community in an even deeper way, consider joining our YouTube membership. You'll get exclusive perks, access to premium content, and the satisfaction of knowing you're helping us keep telling the stories that need to be told. Check the link in the description to join today. As the years accumulated and Levi Stoltzfus aged past 70 and into his 80s, the carefully constructed system he'd maintained for decades began showing signs of strain. The physical decline was unmistakable. Arthritis that made the stairs increasingly difficult. Chronic pain that shortened his patience and reduced his mobility. the early fog of confusion that occasionally caused him to forget appointments or repeat conversations. His visits to Anna's basement room became less frequent as his body failed him, sometimes stretching from twice daily to once daily to every other day. There were periods when Anna went without food or fresh water for 48 hours or more, left to ration whatever remained from his last visit while her mind cycled through possibilities. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he'd been injured. Maybe he'd finally decided to leave her to die alone in the darkness. The networks that had facilitated his trafficking operation were fraying as well, connections dying or retiring or moving away without replacement. The midwife who had provided documentation for so many years was gone. The buyers who had once paid premium prices for off-the-books infants were harder to find as the legal landscape shifted and oversight increased. By 2018, Levi had essentially stopped placing children through his networks, the infrastructure too damaged to support continued operation. The last birth in the basement was in early 2019, and Anna believed that child, like several before, didn't survive more than a few days. Levi never confirmed or denied what happened, and no remains were ever found. For Anna, the uncertainty was a wound that would never fully heal. For Anna, her captor's decline brought a strange and complicated hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. For the first time since 1997, she began to believe she might outlive him, might survive long enough to see the other side of this nightmare, even if she couldn't imagine what that other side might look like. She started planning in ways she hadn't before, not for escape. She was too weak, too conditioned, too uncertain of what lay beyond the door, but for endurance, for lasting long enough that someone might eventually find her. She wrote more in her hidden journal, increasing the archive of her existence with a determination that felt almost defiant. She exercised as much as her small space allowed, trying to maintain enough strength to survive whatever came next. She talked to herself more frequently, holding conversations with her mother and her children, keeping her mind active and engaged because she understood instinctively that her mind was the only tool she had left. The final pregnancy in 2019 was the hardest physically. Her body at 40 years old pushed beyond its limits by decades of malnutrition and repeated childbirth. The labor lasted nearly 3 days, and Anna was convinced at several points that she wouldn't survive it. When the baby finally arrived, she was too weak to do more than hold the tiny form against her chest and whisper the name she'd chosen, Miriam, after her mother, a connection to a past that seemed impossibly distant. The baby was small and struggled to breathe, her cries thin and intermittent in ways that filled Anna with dread. After 2 days, Levi took the child away, and though Anna begged for information about where she was going and whether she was healthy, he provided nothing. She never learned what happened to her youngest daughter. That uncertainty became the final cruelty in a captivity defined by cruelties beyond counting. June 14, 2021, arrived like any other early summer day, warm and bright above ground, while Anna existed in her perpetual twilight below. She didn't know it was the day her father would die, didn't know that his heart would fail him in his sleep, and that he would be found by a neighbor who came to check on him after he missed Sunday service for the first time in 60 years. She knew only that his visit that morning never came, that the hours stretched into a full day, and then another, without the sound of footsteps on the stairs, without the scrape of the bolt being drawn back. She rationed the water and food remaining from his last visit, trying to make it last while her mind cycled through possibilities. Maybe he was sick. Maybe he'd been injured. Maybe he'd finally decided to abandon her entirely, removing himself from the equation while she starved beneath his floorboards. The community buried Levi Stoltzfus with full religious honors on a sunny afternoon in late June, mourning a bishop who had served them faithfully for over 3 decades. Hundreds attended the funeral, filling the cemetery where Miriam had been buried 25 years earlier, their voices raised in traditional German hymns that celebrated a life of service and devotion. Speakers praised his wisdom, his patience, his commitment to the faith. Not one of them knew that less than 50 yards away, his daughter was lying on a thin mattress in a concrete room, slowly dying of dehydration while they said their goodbyes. The dissonance of that moment, a community grieving a monster they believed was a saint, would haunt many of them for years to come. With no known living relatives, the Stoltzfus property went to auction in August 2021. Gerald Patterson, a developer from Philadelphia who saw opportunity in the historic farmhouse, purchased the 97 acres and began making plans for a bed and breakfast that would offer tourists an authentic Amish experience. The property sat empty through September while he arranged financing and hired contractors. Anna survived on the dregs of what remained from Levi's final visit, stretching impossibly small amounts of water across impossibly long days, eating hard bread that she had to soften with saliva before she could chew. She lost track of time completely, no longer sure how many days had passed since his last visit, no longer sure whether days or weeks or months were accumulating above her. She talked to her mother constantly now, holding conversations with Miriam's ghost, preparing herself for a death she had begun to accept as inevitable. On October 1st, a renovation crew arrived at the Stoltzfus farm to begin assessing structural damage. Anna heard the sound of vehicles arriving, voices she didn't recognize, footsteps on the floorboards above. She tried to scream, but her voice was too weak, tried to pound on the hidden door, but her arms couldn't lift. For 2 days, she listened to the work proceeding overhead, salvation mere feet away but impossible to reach. And then, on October 3rd, at approximately 2:47 in the afternoon, a contractor kicked at a rotted board in the cellar, and the wall that had hidden her for nearly 25 years finally began to come down. When Tom Brewer's 911 call reached the Lancaster County Dispatch Center at 2:53 p.m. on October 3, 2021, the operator coded it initially as a welfare check, possibly involving a homeless individual who had taken shelter in an abandoned structure. There was nothing in Tom's breathless description. "There's someone in the basement, a woman, she's been locked in," that prepared the first responders for what they would find. Deputy Russell Crawford was closest to the location, just 7 minutes away on a routine patrol, and he acknowledged the call with the professional composure of a man who had been responding to emergencies for 3 decades. He expected to escort a trespasser off the property, maybe call for medical assistance if the person was injured or intoxicated. He had no idea that the next hour would fundamentally alter his understanding of human capacity for both cruelty and survival. Crawford arrived at 3:17 p.m., parking his cruiser in the gravel driveway where Amish buggies had once deposited visitors for church services and community gatherings. Tom Brewer met him at the door, his face pale and his hands shaking in a way that immediately told Crawford this wasn't a routine call. "You need to see this," Tom said, leading the deputy through the farmhouse and down the cellar stairs. "I've been doing this 30 years. I've never seen anything like this." The cellar looked normal enough at first glance. Stone walls, old shelving, the general clutter of a century-old farmhouse that had accumulated generations of tools and equipment. Then Tom pointed to the western wall, where rotted boards had been pulled away to reveal a gap that led somewhere that shouldn't exist. Crawford clicked on his flashlight and stepped closer, and the smell hit him first. A heavy, used, lived-in smell that told him someone had been breathing this air for a very long time. The beam of his flashlight swept across a space approximately 10 feet by 12 feet, with a ceiling just over 7 feet high. The walls were raw concrete, covered in marks that Crawford initially thought might be water damage or mold, but quickly realized were something else entirely. Thousands of scratches, grouped in sets of 5, the kind of marks you make when you're counting days. A thin mattress lay in one corner, so worn and stained it was barely recognizable as bedding. Metal buckets lined another wall, some with lids and some without, their purpose obvious and stomach-turning. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, currently dark, and in the corner farthest from the gap in the wall, a figure huddled against the concrete, thin arms raised to shield a face that hadn't seen direct light in nearly a quarter century. Crawford had pulled bodies from car wrecks that killed entire families. He had been first on scene at homicides that gave him nightmares for months. He had sat with dying victims and comforted grieving survivors, and seen every kind of violence that human beings could inflict on each other. None of it had prepared him for this. "I knew in that moment," he would later testify, "that I was looking at something beyond anything I'd ever experienced. This wasn't a crime scene. This was a living crime scene. This was someone who had been surviving hell for longer than most people can comprehend. He lowered his flashlight, reducing the direct glare on eyes that couldn't handle it, and spoke in the gentlest voice he could manage. "Ma'am, I'm Deputy Crawford with the Lancaster County Sheriff. We're here to help you. You're safe now." Anna Stoltzfus weighed approximately 98 pounds when they found her, down from the 135 she'd weighed when she entered that room at 18. Her hair had never been cut during her captivity. It reached past her waist, tangled and matted in ways that would require hours of careful work to address. Her skin had the pale, almost translucent quality that comes from years without sunlight, and her eyes couldn't focus properly in the light, squinting and watering in ways that spoke to severe photosensitivity developed over decades of dimness. Her legs could barely support her weight when she tried to stand, atrophied from limited movement in a small space. But her mind, despite everything, remained remarkably intact. When Crawford knelt at the opening and extended his hand toward her, she looked at him with an expression that mixed terror, hope, and something like recognition. Not of him specifically, but of the concept of rescue, the possibility of escape, the idea that the world above had finally decided to look. Emergency medical technicians arrived at 3:41 p.m., summoned by Crawford's urgent radio call requesting immediate medical assistance. They entered the basement with equipment and training designed for trauma victims, though nothing in their experience had prepared them for trauma of this duration and magnitude. The lead paramedic, a woman named Jennifer Walsh, who had been doing this work for 15 years, would later describe the rescue as the most affecting moment of her career. "You're trained to stay professional," she said, "to focus on vital signs and treatment protocols and transport logistics. But when you're lifting a woman out of a room where she's been held for nearly 25 years, professionalism only takes you so far. You're human. You feel it." Jennifer and her team treated Anna with extraordinary gentleness, explaining every action before taking it, moving slowly and carefully to avoid triggering additional fear. They loaded Anna onto a gurney and prepared to carry her up the stairs she had descended on April 17, 1997, expecting to help with a chore, and instead entering a nightmare that would consume her entire adult life. The paramedics warned her that the light would be bright outside, that she should keep her eyes closed until they could provide sunglasses and give her time to adjust. Anna nodded, understanding, but as they neared the top of the stairs, she opened her eyes anyway, needing to see, needing to know that this was real, and not another hallucination born of desperation. The late afternoon light was overcast, gray and gentle, filtered through clouds that spared her the direct sun that would have been unbearable. It was still the brightest thing she'd seen in nearly 25 years, and tears streamed down her face, not from sadness, but from sheer sensory overload, her nervous system flooded with stimuli it had forgotten how to process. At 6:41 p.m., Anna Stoltzfus stepped outside for the first time since 1997. The air smelled like autumn, decomposing leaves, wood smoke from a distant fire, the particular crispness of Pennsylvania in October. There was a breeze, and the movement of air on her face was overwhelming after decades of still, stale basement atmosphere. Sound was everywhere. Birds, insects, the crunch of gravel, voices calling to each other, car engines and radio chatter. The world was loud and bright and enormous, nothing like the concrete box she had inhabited for half her life. She asked the paramedic walking beside her, "Is this morning?" Jennifer Walsh shook her head gently. "It's evening, but for you, it's a new day." A crowd had gathered in the driveway and along the road, word spreading through the rural community with the speed that only small towns can achieve. Among the watchers were faces that Anna couldn't see clearly through her light-damaged eyes, but that would later be identified by investigators. Harold Weaver, the mail carrier who had delivered to this farm for decades without asking questions. Neighbors who had lived within earshot of her prison without ever hearing her screams. Amish families who had prayed and worked and raised children less than 50 yards from where she had been suffering. One older Amish man gripped the fence post so hard his knuckles went white, watching the ambulance prepare to depart, with a woman he had assumed was living somewhere in Ohio for the past quarter century. "I heard something once," he murmured to the person standing next to him. 20 years ago, maybe more. Crying. I told myself it was the TV. He watched the ambulance pull away, lights flashing, and understood that his comfortable explanation had cost a woman nearly 25 years of her life. Once Anna Stoltzfus was safely transported to Lancaster General Hospital, the farmhouse transformed from a renovation project into one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Pennsylvania history. Investigators from the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office arrived within hours, followed by Pennsylvania State Police detectives and, once the scope of the case became clear, FBI agents who would eventually take lead on the trafficking charges. The property was secured with yellow tape and armed guards. The renovation crew sent home with instructions not to discuss what they'd seen, though of course by then the rumors were already spreading through the county like wildfire. For the next 3 months, teams of forensic specialists would document every inch of the Stoltzfus property, cataloging evidence of crimes that had been committed over nearly a quarter century, while the world above remained oblivious. The hidden room itself yielded evidence that corroborated Anna's eventual testimony in devastating detail. The scratch marks on the walls numbered over 9,000, representing her attempt to track the passing days, even after the numbers became too large to comprehend. Fiber analysis of the mattress revealed biological evidence spanning decades, layers of DNA that told a story of repeated assault and repeated childbirth. The waste buckets contained residue that forensic technicians could date to various periods, creating a chemical timeline of captivity. Most significant were the journal fragments that investigators recovered from cracks in the concrete, behind the mattress, sewn into the hem of clothing. Hundreds of scraps of paper covered in coded writing that Anna later translated, an archive of suffering that would become crucial evidence in the prosecution of others. Upstairs in Levi's living quarters, investigators found a locked desk that contained records meticulous enough to make an accountant proud and horrifying enough to make seasoned detectives sick. Ledgers documented dates, descriptions, and amounts corresponding to child placements spanning more than 2 decades. Contact information for midwives, doctors, and buyers was organized alphabetically. Forged birth certificates, falsified medical records, and fraudulent custody documents were filed in folders labeled with dates. Photographs showed Levi at various community events, weddings, church services, funerals, the picture of Amish respectability, a bishop honored by his flock. The contrast between the public image documented in those photographs and the private reality documented in those ledgers was stark enough to cause one investigator to step outside and vomit in the yard. The financial forensics painted a picture of profit that transformed Anna's suffering into someone else's retirement fund. Over nearly 25 years, approximately $450,000 in unexplained deposits flowed through accounts controlled by Levi Stoltzfus. The deposits were sporadic, but correlated with the approximate dates of child placements recorded in the ledgers. Money had been laundered through fictitious furniture sales and livestock transactions. False invoices filed for products that never existed. Some funds had been used to maintain the property, including the renovations to the cellar that had created the hidden room. The money trail led investigators to buyers in 3 states, couples who had paid premium prices for children delivered without questions or background checks, or any of the scrutiny that legitimate adoption requires. DNA testing began almost immediately, Anna providing samples eagerly, despite her fragile physical state, desperate to find the children who had been taken from her over so many years. The process was painstaking and emotionally devastating. Each confirmed match represented both a found child and a lost decade, each reunion conversation filled with joy and grief in roughly equal measure. By December 2021, investigators had located 17 of the 23 children. Some were now adults in their late 20s, living in states as far away as Wisconsin and Virginia, raised by families who had been told various lies about their origins. Some were still minors, teenagers living with adoptive families who claimed ignorance of the circumstances that had brought these children into their homes. Each case required its own investigation, its own careful documentation, its own sensitive conversations with people whose entire understanding of their own identities was about to be shattered. 4 children were never located, a fact that weighed on Anna more heavily than almost anything else. She believed these children had died. She had distinct memories of stillbirths and deaths within days of birth during her captivity. But Levi had removed the bodies without telling her where they were taken, and that information died with him. Investigators searched the Stoltzfus property extensively, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, but no remains were ever found. Levi may have disposed of the bodies in the woods, in a neighboring property, in some location that will never be discovered. For Anna, the uncertainty was a wound that couldn't heal. 4 children she had carried and loved and lost, whose fates she would never know, whose graves she could never visit. The investigation into their whereabouts remains officially open, though meaningful progress after so many years seems unlikely. The legal complications were substantial and frustrating. Levi Stoltzfus was dead, beyond the reach of any earthly justice, already buried with the religious honors that his community believed he deserved. This meant the primary perpetrator could never be charged, tried, or punished, could never face his daughter in a courtroom and hear her testimony, could never answer for the decades of horror he had inflicted. The midwife who had falsified so many documents had passed away in 2015. The doctor who had signed fraudulent medical records, Samuel Morrison, was located in a nursing home suffering from dementia, so advanced he couldn't remember his own name, let alone crimes he had committed years earlier. Prosecutors redirected their efforts toward those who had facilitated Levi's crimes and remained capable of standing trial. The buyers who had paid for children, those who had known, or should have known, that something was deeply wrong. Anna Stoltzfus was admitted to Lancaster General Hospital under a pseudonym for her protection. Her real name kept off official records, while investigators scrambled to understand the scope of what had happened, and media organizations began circling the story like sharks sensing blood in the water. Her initial treatment focused on the physical crisis of a body pushed beyond its limits for nearly 25 years. Severe malnutrition and vitamin deficiencies that had weakened her bones and compromised her immune system. Osteoporosis that made her skeleton fragile as a bird's. Chronic infections that had been fought for years with nothing but willpower and whatever minimal supplies Levi had deigned to provide. She had developed severe vitamin D deficiency from decades without sunlight, leaving her vulnerable to a cascade of secondary problems. Her teeth required extensive reconstruction after years of inadequate nutrition and no dental care. Her eyes needed careful treatment to adjust to normal light levels after so long in dimness. The psychological assessment revealed a mind that had survived impossible circumstances through adaptation and compartmentalization. Dr. Eleanor Vincent, the trauma specialist assigned to Anna's case, diagnosed complex post-traumatic stress disorder with dissociative features, a clinical way of describing a psyche that had learned to split itself into pieces in order to survive. Anna experienced flashbacks triggered by enclosed spaces, male authority figures, certain smells and sounds that transported her instantly back to the basement. She had difficulty making decisions, even simple ones about what to eat or what to wear, after decades of having every choice removed from her control. She struggled with trust in ways that would take years to address, understandably wary of anyone who claimed to have her best interests at heart. But she also demonstrated remarkable resilience. Her memory was sharp, her reasoning clear, her determination to rebuild her life evident from the earliest days of her recovery. 3 weeks after her rescue, Anna agreed to speak with investigators for the first time. The interview was conducted by Detective Patricia Malloy, a specialist in trafficking cases chosen specifically because Anna had expressed fear of male questioners, an entirely reasonable response given what she had endured. The conversation lasted 4 hours over 2 days with frequent breaks when the emotional weight became too heavy to bear. Anna's account was methodical and devastating, describing the grooming that followed her mother's death, the day of her imprisonment, the systematic abuse that followed, each pregnancy and birth and loss, with the kind of detail that only someone who had lived through it could provide. She spoke of her survival strategies, her hidden journal, her mental escapes into imagined worlds where her children grew up happy and free. She spoke of her belief that she would die in that room, that no one would ever find her, that her existence would simply end one day without anyone knowing she had ever been there. One exchange from the interview would later be quoted extensively in news coverage of the case. Detective Malloy asked Anna if she had ever tried to escape. Anna was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant, remembering. Then she said, "You don't understand. Escape to where? Everyone I knew was in that community. They all trusted him. They all believed him. If I had somehow gotten out, where would I have gone? Who would have believed me? A young woman accusing a bishop of terrible crimes. He had an answer for everything. I had nothing. The only way out was death, and I wasn't ready to choose that. So I stayed. I survived. That was all I could do." The words captured something essential about the psychology of captivity, the way it doesn't just imprison the body but reshapes the mind, creating barriers that don't require physical locks. The rehabilitation process extended far beyond medical treatment into the basic skills of living that most adults take for granted. Anna had entered the basement at 18, before she had learned to drive, before she had held a job, before she had experienced the mundane milestones of adult life. She emerged at 42, having missed the entire digital revolution. She had never used a cell phone, a computer, an ATM, or a microwave. She had never filed taxes, rented an apartment, applied for a job, or navigated the bureaucratic systems that structure modern existence. A team of social workers helped her learn these basics one by one, patient guides through a world that must have seemed as foreign as another planet. Every interaction required explanation and practice. How to use a debit card, how to navigate a grocery store, how to operate a television remote control. Tasks that others accomplish without thinking required Anna to build new neural pathways, learning in her 40s what most people absorb in their teens. Physical therapy helped her rebuild the muscle mass and mobility she had lost during decades of confinement in a small space. She learned to walk distances longer than 10 feet, her legs gradually strengthening to support travel beyond the concrete walls that had bounded her world. She adjusted to sunlight gradually, wearing dark glasses for months, while her eyes adapted to brightness they hadn't experienced since she was a teenager. Occupational therapy addressed the fine motor skills that had atrophied. Holding a pen, using scissors, the 100 small coordinated movements that daily life requires. Psychological therapy worked on the deeper damage, using trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and EMDR to process memories that threatened to overwhelm her, teaching her coping strategies for the triggers that would probably never entirely go away. The first reunion with one of her children occurred in January 2022, nearly 3 months after her rescue. Rebecca, the fourth child, had been born in 2001 and placed with an Amish family in Indiana who believed they were adopting an orphan. She was 20 years old when investigators contacted her with news that shattered everything she thought she knew about herself. Her mother was alive, had been imprisoned for decades, had loved her and thought about her every day for her entire life. Rebecca agreed to meet, though she later admitted she wasn't sure what she hoped to find. The encounter was held in a neutral location, a social worker's office in Lancaster, with therapists available if either woman needed support. They wept. They held hands. They said almost nothing for the first hour, the weight of the moment too enormous for words. Finally, Rebecca asked the question that had been burning since she learned the truth. "Did you think about me?" Anna's answer: "Every day. Every single day. I named you Hope. I told you stories in the dark. I made you real in my mind so I could survive. I never stopped thinking about you. Not for one moment." The Amish community's response to the revelation of Levi Stoltzfus's crimes was complex, divided, and often contradictory in ways that reflected the difficulty of processing such profound betrayal. Official statements from church leaders expressed profound sorrow for Anna's suffering, while emphasizing that Levi's actions represented the work of one man, not a reflection of our faith or community. The bishop who succeeded Levi announced the formation of a committee to review safeguards for vulnerable members, an acknowledgement that existing structures had failed catastrophically, even as it stopped short of admitting systemic problems. Several churches in the area held special services of prayer and reflection, inviting members to examine their own consciences and ask what they might have missed, what questions they might have failed to ask, what assumptions they might have accepted too readily. Individual responses varied enormously, depending on proximity to the Stoltzfus family and personal temperament. Many families were genuinely horrified, grieving for Anna and confronting their own failure to see what had been happening in their midst. Others were defensive, insisting that this was an aberration rather than a systemic vulnerability, that the Amish way of life remained sound despite this one terrible exception. Some began asking harder questions about the structures that had allowed Levi to operate unchecked, the unaccountable authority of bishops, the isolation from outside oversight, the cultural preference for handling problems internally rather than involving English authorities. These conversations were uncomfortable and often heated, challenging assumptions that had been accepted for generations, but they were necessary, and for some community members, they represented the beginning of meaningful change. The question of shunning arose quickly and created significant theological controversy. Under normal circumstances, the Amish impose Meidung, formal shunning, on members who leave the faith or commit serious sins, cutting them off from community interaction until they repent. Levi was dead and could not be shunned in any meaningful sense. But should his memory be preserved in the community records, his grave maintained alongside those of faithful members, his name spoken with the respect traditionally accorded to bishops. Some argued for symbolic posthumous shunning, stripping his name from any honors and removing his grave from the church cemetery. Others countered that such action was unprecedented and potentially sacrilegious, interfering with God's judgment of the dead. The debate remained unresolved for months, different congregations reaching different conclusions, the lack of clear consensus itself a sign of the confusion Levi's crimes had created. Anna herself was offered an opportunity to return to the Amish community if she wished, to be welcomed back among the people who had raised her before everything changed. She declined, gently but firmly, explaining that she bore no anger toward the community as a whole, but could not live among people who had unknowingly enabled her imprisonment, walking past homes where her children had been raised without knowing their true origins, attending services in buildings where her father had preached while she languished in his basement. "I need to build something new," she told the officials who extended the invitation. "Something that's mine, not something that was given to me by people who didn't see what was happening. I don't blame them, but I can't pretend that everything is normal either." Her choice was respected, though some community members expressed sadness that the church had lost her twice, once to her father's crimes, and once to the aftermath that made returning impossible. The English community faced its own uncomfortable reckoning with questions that had no easy answers. The delivery driver who had heard crying and driven away. The assessor who had accepted an excuse about flooding. The neighbors who had noticed odd patterns, but told themselves it wasn't their business to pry. These individuals were not criminals. They could not be charged with any offense. But they carried knowledge of their own failures that would stay with them forever. A town hall meeting in December 2021 drew standing room only attendance as residents gathered to process what had happened and ask what could be done to prevent similar horrors in the future. The conversation was raw and honest in ways that small-town discussions rarely achieve. People stood and spoke about moments when they had sensed something wrong and chosen to look away. They acknowledged their complicity in a system that valued politeness over vigilance, that accepted easy explanations rather than asking hard questions. One speaker in particular captured the mood of the evening. An older woman named Eleanor Price, who had lived 3 miles from the Stoltzfus farm her entire life. She stood before her neighbors, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her face, and delivered words that would be quoted in news coverage nationwide. "We talk about, if you see something, say something. We put it on bumper stickers and posters and feel good about ourselves for spreading the message. But when we actually see something, something that doesn't quite add up, something that makes us uncomfortable, we tell ourselves a story that lets us walk away. We tell ourselves it's not our business. We tell ourselves someone else will handle it. We tell ourselves that respectable people don't do terrible things. I'm 68 years old. I've lived 3 miles from that farm my entire life. And I'm here tonight to say that I failed. We all failed. And we need to figure out how to do better, so that no one else has to pay the price for our willingness to look away." Since Levi Stoltzfus could not be prosecuted posthumously, investigators and prosecutors focused their efforts on the network of individuals who had facilitated his trafficking operation over the decades. The challenge was substantial. Many participants were dead or incapacitated, documentation was incomplete or deliberately destroyed, and the passage of time had complicated both evidence gathering and statute of limitations calculations. But several cases moved forward successfully, delivering at least partial justice for crimes that had seemed destined to go unpunished. The Kaufman prosecution became the centerpiece of the government's case against buyers who had knowingly participated in illegal adoption schemes. Robert and Linda Kaufman were an English couple from Bucks County who had purchased 2 children through Levi's network in 2008 and 2011, paying $35,000 and $42,000 respectively for infants delivered without questions or documentation. Their defense team argued that they had believed they were participating in a private religious adoption facilitated by a trusted community leader, that they had no knowledge of the children's true origins or the circumstances of their births. The prosecution countered with communications showing the Kaufmans had specifically sought no questions asked arrangements, financial records linking them to other black market adoption schemes, and testimony from a third party who recalled hearing Robert Kaufman say he didn't want to know where the kids came from. The trial lasted 3 weeks and attracted national media attention as one of the first major prosecutions stemming from Anna's case. Witnesses included social workers, financial investigators, and adoptive families who had received children through Levi's network without realizing the horror behind their apparent good fortune. The most powerful testimony came from Anna herself, who took the stand for nearly 6 hours over 2 days, describing her captivity, her pregnancies, the moment each child was taken from her arms. She spoke calmly and clearly, having prepared extensively with her therapists and victim advocates. But the content of her words needed no dramatic delivery to devastate everyone who heard them. Jurors wept openly. Court reporters requested breaks to compose themselves. The Kaufmans sat stone-faced throughout, maintaining their innocence, even as the evidence mounted against them. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon in October 2022, almost exactly 1 year after Anna's rescue. Robert Kaufman was found guilty of conspiracy to commit human trafficking, adoption fraud, and related charges. He received a sentence of 12 years in federal prison. Linda Kaufman was found guilty of the same charges, but received a lighter sentence of 8 years, the judge acknowledging evidence that she had been less involved in the logistics of the transactions. Both filed immediate appeals that remain pending as of this documentary's completion. The children they had purchased, now teenagers, were removed from their home and placed with relatives while their legal status was determined. Another generation of victims whose lives had been shaped by decisions made before they were old enough to understand. Civil litigation provided another avenue for accountability where criminal prosecution was impossible. Though Dr. Samuel Morrison could not stand trial due to his mental incapacity, his estate remained subject to civil action for his role in falsifying medical records over decades. Anna Stoltzfus, represented pro bono by a Philadelphia law firm specializing in victim advocacy, sued the Morrison estate for damages stemming from his complicity in her captivity and exploitation. The case was settled out of court for $1.2 million. Not adequate compensation for what Anna had endured, but resources that would help her rebuild her life and provide for her future. Additional civil suits were filed against the estates of other deceased participants and against living individuals who had played supporting roles in the trafficking network. 3 other couples who had received children through Levi's arrangements were identified during the investigation, each presenting different circumstances and culpability levels. 2 couples cooperated fully with investigators, providing evidence and testimony in exchange for immunity from prosecution. They claimed genuine ignorance of the children's origins and demonstrated willingness to participate in whatever reunification or disclosure process the courts deemed appropriate. The third couple faced charges but ultimately pleaded to reduced counts, receiving probation rather than prison time in exchange for their cooperation. The legal outcomes were imperfect, as legal outcomes in complex cases often are, but they established precedents and sent messages about accountability that extended beyond the specific individuals involved. By the time legal proceedings concluded in late 2023, investigators had located 19 of the 23 children, 2 more than the initial 17 identified in late 2021. The additional discoveries came through continued forensic work and tips from individuals who recognized descriptions in media coverage. The ongoing efforts to locate the 4 missing children continued, though with diminishing hope that meaningful answers would ever be found. 3 years after her rescue, Anna Stoltzfus has built something that might not look like much to outside observers, but represents a miracle of reconstruction to anyone who understands where she started. She lives in a small apartment in a mid-sized Pennsylvania city, its location kept confidential for her protection, far enough from Lancaster County that she doesn't risk running into community members who might recognize her, but close enough that she can visit her children when they want to see her. The apartment has large windows on multiple walls, a feature she specifically requested when working with social services to find housing. "I never want to be in a room without natural light again," she told her caseworker. "I need to see the sky. I need to know the sun is there." The space is modestly furnished but contains items that are uniquely hers, chosen by her, arranged according to her preferences. Books she selected herself, plants she tends carefully, photographs of the children she has been reunited with. Her daily routine would seem ordinary to most people, which is precisely what makes it extraordinary given where she came from. She works part-time at a local library, shelving books and helping patrons locate materials, a job that allows her to be around people without the intense social demands of customer service, while engaging the mind that remains sharp, despite everything designed to destroy it. She attends therapy twice weekly, continuing the trauma-focused work that began in the hospital, learning new coping strategies and processing old wounds at a pace her therapist carefully calibrates. She has learned to drive, passing her test on the 3rd attempt, and now navigating city streets with a competence that would have seemed impossible during her early months of freedom. She owns a cell phone and knows how to use it, though she still finds the constant connectivity of modern life somewhat overwhelming and often leaves it on silent. Her relationships with her surviving children remain the center of her emotional life, though those relationships are necessarily complex and evolving. Of the 19 children who were located, Anna has met 12 in person and maintains ongoing relationships with 8. Some of those relationships are close. She speaks with Rebecca almost daily, sharing the mundane details of ordinary life that they were denied for so long. Others are more tentative, children who want to know their biological mother, but are still processing the trauma of their own identities being rewritten. 7 children have chosen distance, not from anger at Anna, but from the overwhelming nature of the situation. They need time and space to figure out who they are before they can figure out who they are in relation to her. 3 have not responded to her attempts at communication, and she respects their silence, hoping that someday they might feel ready to reach out while accepting that they may never do so. The psychological recovery continues, slower in some ways than she expected and faster in others. Some triggers have faded with time and treatment. She can now enter small rooms without panic, though she still prefers open spaces. Other triggers remain potent despite years of work. Male authority figures still require careful preparation before meetings. Certain smells can transport her instantly back to the basement, and the anniversary of her capture each April remains extremely difficult. She has learned to recognize when she's heading into a dissociative episode and to use grounding techniques her therapist taught her. But the episodes still happen, less frequently than before, but never entirely gone. Night terrors come less often now, maybe once or twice a month rather than nightly, but when they come, they're as vivid and devastating as ever, leaving her exhausted and shaken the following day. Her faith has become something complicated and personal, neither the simple trust of her Amish upbringing, nor the angry rejection that might have been expected after what she endured. She believes in God. That belief survived everything. But her understanding of God has been entirely reconstructed from the version her father weaponized against her. "I don't believe God wanted what happened to me," she said in one of her rare public statements. "I don't believe God chose my father for anything except to test my ability to survive. I believe God was with me in that room, in the small ways I found to keep going, in the love I felt for my children, even when I couldn't protect them. That's the God I believe in now, not the God my father claimed to speak for." She doesn't attend any church regularly, but occasionally visits different congregations, searching for a community that feels right without being willing to commit to any single expression of the faith that both sustained and betrayed her. The journal she began keeping after her rescue has grown to fill several volumes, documenting her thoughts and experiences with an honesty she was never permitted during her captivity. The first entry, written on the day she emerged from the basement, contains words that have been quoted often in the years since. He called it protection. It was prison. I survived anyway. More recent entries reflect a woman slowly discovering who she is when she's not just surviving. Her preferences, her opinions, her hopes for a future that extends beyond simply making it through another day. Today I walked to the grocery store, reads one entry from earlier this year. No one accompanied me. No one watched me. No one told me what to buy or when to return. I chose apples because I wanted apples. Such a small thing. Such an enormous thing. I am learning that freedom is made of small things. Each one is a gift. Each one is evidence that I am still here. The story of Anna Stoltzfus is not simply the story of one monstrous man and one resilient victim. It is a case study in how abuse conceals itself within respected institutions, how silence accumulates until it becomes indistinguishable from consent, how communities can fail their most vulnerable members while believing they are doing everything right. The lessons from her experience extend far beyond Lancaster County, far beyond the Amish community, to any context where authority goes unquestioned, where privacy becomes secrecy, where asking uncomfortable questions feels more dangerous than accepting comfortable lies. The role of religious authority in enabling Levi's crimes cannot be overstated or reduced to simple anti-religious sentiment. His position as bishop gave him automatic credibility that deflected suspicion before it could form. When he provided explanations for Anna's disappearance, she went to Ohio. She joined the English world. She doesn't want contact with family. Those explanations were accepted because they came from a man chosen through sacred process to lead his community. Most people would rather accept an imperfect explanation than challenge their fundamental beliefs about how spiritual leadership works. This isn't a flaw specific to Amish faith. It's a pattern that repeats in every religious tradition where human leaders claim divine authority, where the structures designed to preserve spiritual purity can also preserve spiritual corruption. Community insularity played an equally significant role, creating conditions where outsiders hesitated to interfere and insiders lacked external reference points. Amish communities are intentionally separate from mainstream society, maintaining boundaries that preserve traditional values, but also prevent the kind of external oversight that might catch what internal systems miss. The English neighbors who sensed something wrong told themselves it wasn't their place to pry into Amish business. The Amish families who had momentary concerns told themselves that bishops could be trusted and that community matters should be handled internally. This mutual deference created a blind spot large enough to hide a woman for nearly 25 years, each side assuming the other would notice problems while neither side actually looked. The currency of respectability functioned as protective coloring for a predator who understood exactly how to weaponize appearances. Levi Stoltzfus presented himself precisely as society expects good men to present: humble, hard-working, devout, dedicated to service. He dressed plainly, spoke softly, helped his neighbors, led his congregation with apparent wisdom and care. We are trained from childhood to trust these markers of virtue, to assume that people who look and act a certain way must be what they appear to be. Predators know this and exploit it systematically, investing in the performance of respectability as a strategy for accessing and abusing victims. The lesson is not that we should trust no one, which would make social life impossible, but that we should recognize respectability as a performance that can be mastered by anyone, including those whose private behavior contradicts their public image. The role of passive bystanders, the people who almost saw and almost asked and almost acted, reveals perhaps the most uncomfortable truth of all. Dozens of individuals had moments over the decades when something didn't seem right, when an explanation didn't quite add up, when instinct suggested that further investigation was warranted. The delivery driver who heard crying, the assessor who was told about flooding, the neighbors who noticed unusual patterns. None of these people were evil. None of them wished Anna harm. They simply made the same choice that most of us would probably make in similar circumstances. They accepted the comfortable story rather than pursuing the uncomfortable truth. They told themselves it wasn't their business, that someone else would handle it, that respectable people don't do terrible things. And in doing so, they became part of the architecture of silence that kept Anna imprisoned. The specific recommendations that emerged from this case offer concrete steps toward preventing similar horrors. Communities should develop clear protocols for checking on individuals who suddenly disappear, especially young women who vanish without any external verification of their whereabouts. Authorities need cultural competency training when interacting with insular religious communities, understanding both how to respect different traditions and how to identify when those traditions are being weaponized to conceal abuse. Individuals must learn to trust their instincts when something feels wrong, accepting the discomfort of asking questions rather than the complicity of assuming everything is fine. None of these measures would have guaranteed Anna's rescue, but any one of them might have shortened her captivity or prevented it entirely. The Stoltzfus farm looks nothing like it did on the day Anna was discovered. The property sat empty through most of 2022. Too associated with horror to attract the tourists, Gerald Patterson had imagined filling its renovated rooms. In 2023, an anonymous buyer, later revealed to be a survivor advocacy nonprofit, purchased the land with a specific plan that Anna helped design. The farmhouse was demolished that summer, its walls and floors and foundation dismantled and hauled away, erasing the structure that had contained so much suffering. The basement was filled with concrete, sealing the hidden room forever, ensuring that no one would ever again descend those stairs into darkness. On the site where the house once stood, a simple garden was planted, flowers that bloom in rotating seasons, a few fruit trees that will take years to mature, a wooden bench facing east toward the morning sun. A small plaque near the bench reads, "In memory of the silenced, in hope for the heard." Anna was invited to visit the property before the demolition, to stand one final time in the place where her life was stolen and reclaimed. She came on a quiet afternoon in July, accompanied by her therapist and 2 of her children, and walked the grounds slowly, stopping at places that held memories only she could access. She stood at the cellar door, the door her father had locked behind her nearly 25 years earlier, and wept openly, letting grief and rage and relief pour out of her in equal measure. She didn't go inside. She didn't need to see the room again. It existed vividly enough in her memory without refreshing the image. She simply stood at the threshold between the world above and the world below, acknowledging what had happened and choosing to turn away. The drive home was quiet, her children holding her hands in the back seat, nothing needing to be said that wasn't communicated through presence and touch. This documentary began with a question. How does a woman disappear for nearly 25 years in a place where everyone knows everyone, where community is supposed to mean connection and accountability and mutual care? The answer, as we have seen, is painful in its simplicity. She disappears because we let her. Not through malice or conspiracy, not through deliberate cruelty or conscious decision, but through the accumulated weight of small silences, small acceptances, small decisions not to ask the question that might have an uncomfortable answer. Levi Stoltzfus was a monster, and his monstrousness was his own responsibility. But monsters don't operate in vacuums. They operate in communities that have decided, consciously or not, that certain people's stories matter more than others, that certain figures are beyond suspicion, that asking questions is impolite. Anna Stoltzfus survived nearly 25 years of imprisonment because she had no other choice. Survival was not heroism, it was biology and psychology, responding to circumstances beyond her control, finding ways to persist when persistence seemed impossible. But what she's doing now, that is heroism. Building a life from nothing when you don't know how. Trusting people when trust was weaponized against you. Believing you deserve to exist when everything tried to convince you otherwise. Learning to make choices when choice was stolen from you for half your life. These are acts of courage that don't make headlines, but represent victories more significant than any courtroom verdict or public recognition could provide. Her story doesn't have a tidy ending. The children scattered across the country carry their own wounds that will take lifetimes to address. The community that failed her continues working through what it means and what should change. The systems that allowed this to happen are still mostly intact, still vulnerable to exploitation by any one patient and respected enough to game them. Justice was partial at best. The primary perpetrator was already dead. The accomplices received sentences that seem inadequate to the scale of the harm. The buyers who purchased children will eventually be released to resume their lives while Anna and her children live with the consequences forever. There is no conclusion that makes this right. There is only continuation, the ongoing work of survival and recovery, and making meaning from meaninglessness. But something did change on October 3rd, 2021, something that matters even amid all the things that remain broken. A wall came down. A woman walked out of darkness into a world she barely remembered. Blinking against light her eyes had forgotten how to process, breathing air that moved and smelled of autumn and tasted like freedom. The world learned what happens when we stop asking questions, and some small portion of that world resolved to ask questions more often, to look more closely at the comfortable explanations, to believe survivors when they speak. That's not enough. It's not nearly enough, but it's something, and something is what we have to work with. Anna Stoltzfus sits in her apartment as we conclude this documentary. Afternoon light streaming through windows she specifically requested. A journal open on the table in front of her. She's writing something we can't see, adding to the record of a life that almost went unrecorded, documenting existence that almost remained unknown. She looks up from the page, toward the window, toward the light. She almost smiles. Not quite, but almost the shadow of an expression that might someday become joy. She's alive. She's free. And that has to be enough, not because it compensates for what was taken, but because it's all there is. Survival, continuation, the stubborn insistence on existing despite everything that tried to extinguish existence. The basement is gone now. The house is demolished. The man who built the prison is buried in the ground. But the real question remains. The question this documentary has been asking all along. If your pastor, your neighbor, your community leader told you their daughter went away, would you just nod and move on? Or would you ask one more question? Because sometimes the difference between a horror story and a rescue is just one person refusing to accept the easy version of events. Anna Stoltzfus waited nearly 25 years for that person. Somewhere, right now, someone else might be waiting too. Thank you for watching this documentary and staying with us through Anna's story. If you found value in what we've shared today, please take a moment to like this video, share it with people who need to hear it, and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the stories we'll tell next. Every engagement helps us reach more people, and every viewer becomes part of a community that believes these stories deserve to be told. Together, we can make sure that the silenced are heard and that the questions keep being asked. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other.